I was standing beside my grandmother's chair, studying the paper plate on her lap, when Ethan came up behind me and spoke without turning his head. "Get your bag. Act normal." The words arrived before the room did. Balloons floated above the patio. The speaker played an old song at a careful volume. Someone clapped too early near the cake table. My grandmother, Eleanor, rested her hand in mine, light as folded paper, the blue shawl pulled tight around her shoulders even though the afternoon was warm. I didn't look at him. I watched his reflection in the glass of the sliding door, still, alert, measuring distances. He took half a step back. Our signal. The one we used when leaving places quietly, when nothing could appear wrong. I leaned down and told Eleanor I needed the bathroom. She nodded, clapping at something Natalie was saying by the banner. The banner was centered, level, printed. "Happy birthday." The house behind us looked finished, sealed. Fresh paint, furniture shifted just enough to erase memory. We moved through the guests without haste. Ethan laughed once when someone joked about us sneaking out. Inside, the air changed. He handed me my purse and phone. His eyes traced the hallway, the window, the corner by the stairs. Outside, kids ran across the lawn. The sun still sat high. He unlocked the car, waited until I was inside, then locked the doors. The sound was sharp. He didn't start the engine. He watched the mirror, then turned to me. The party continued behind us. Something else had already begun. Ethan eased the car out of the driveway without signaling urgency. He took the long curve past the hedges instead of the short turn to the main road. I watched the family house recede in the side mirror. The banner lifted once in the breeze and settled back into place, perfectly level. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier. A Sunday afternoon call while I was folding towels. My father's name on the screen. Richard Caldwell. We hadn't argued in years. We simply didn't talk. Every conversation left something unfinished, like a form left unsigned. His voice had been bright, rehearsed. He said Eleanor was turning 86. He said Natalie was organizing a proper celebration. He said it would mean a lot if I came home to Ashland. I said yes before he finished. Some decisions don't feel like choices. Eleanor had raised me in the gaps when others didn't. She was the constant in a house that rearranged itself without warning. When I told Ethan, he didn't interrupt. He asked where the party was. He asked who else would be there. He booked a motel 10 minutes from the house that night and forwarded me the confirmation. He said it was just in case the house felt tight. I knew what he meant. That house had a way of closing doors quietly. The drive south took 6 hours. Ethan checked the tires twice before we left. He kept the charger plugged in. He asked about my childhood, and I answered with details that had been smoothed by repetition. Lemonade on the porch, cookies broken in halves, Eleanor's hands steady when everything else wasn't. I didn't talk about Natalie. There was nothing to add. Ashland looked smaller than I remembered. The Caldwell house looked staged. The lawn cut to an exact line, balloons tied at even intervals, curtains open but unmoving. Inside, the furniture had shifted just enough to erase old paths. The rug I used to color on was gone. The walls were fresh. The air felt held. Richard hugged me a second too long. Natalie kissed my cheek and stepped back to check her clipboard. She smiled the way she did when numbers were involved. Guests filled the space, distant cousins, neighbors I didn't recognize, people who didn't reach for food. Men in jackets stood where sightlines crossed and watched without watching. Eleanor sat in her chair by the window, the blue shawl around her shoulders. She was thinner, paler. She smiled when she saw me, then looked again as if I'd shifted places. Her grip weakened halfway through the squeeze. When Ethan greeted her, she called him Jack. She never forgot names. Natalie said it was age and moved on. Music covered the pause. Ethan stepped outside once, then again. He didn't stay long. When he returned, his jaw was set. He asked me to keep talking to Eleanor, to keep her awake. In the hallway, away from the sound, he lowered his voice. "They're recording." I didn't ask how he knew. The house hummed under the music. "Wires under the porch," he said. "Hidden, and her medicine isn't where it should be." I watched Eleanor's head tip back against the chair. Candles were lit. Someone called for photos. The room gathered itself for a moment it wanted to keep. Ethan touched my arm once. It was time to leave. I nodded before I understood why. I stayed by Eleanor's chair after Ethan slipped away again. The music continued at the same volume. Paper plates shifted hands. Someone adjusted the cake knife so it aligned with the edge of the table. I took the paper cup from Eleanor's fingers before it tipped and replaced it with a fresh one. She drank when I lifted it, small sips, eyes unfocused past my shoulder. The men in jackets hadn't moved. One stood near the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Another had positioned himself by the back door, close enough to see the driveway through the glass. Their plates were clean. Their hands were empty. When people passed, they angled their bodies just enough to keep sightlines clear. Natalie crossed the room with her clipboard tucked under her arm, checking names, smoothing gaps. She paused beside Eleanor, placed a hand on the blue shawl, and pulled it tighter. The fabric covered Eleanor's wrists. I noticed a faint indentation at the base of her thumb, a mark that hadn't been there before. I asked where Eleanor's medication was kept now. Natalie smiled without stopping. "She's already had what she needs." The smile held. Then she moved on to the cake. Richard stood near the photographs, gesturing toward frames that weren't from my childhood. He talked about renovations, about how much work it took to get the house ready. He said Eleanor deserved a proper setting. I watched him correct a picture by a 1/4 inch and step back to check alignment. Eleanor leaned toward me, her head heavy against my shoulder. She said my name once, then fell quiet. I felt the weight of her breathing slow. I counted it, the way I had when I was younger and she slept through storms. 4 in, 4 out. The rhythm wasn't right. Ethan came back inside and took up a place where he could see the kitchen and the hallway at the same time. He didn't sit. His eyes tracked movement. When Natalie announced photos outside, he didn't follow. He stayed close to Eleanor. I watched a man in scrubs appear briefly at the edge of the kitchen, a duffel bag slung low. He turned when he noticed me looking and stepped back out of sight. The bag didn't look like a gift. The cake candles were lit. The room tightened around the moment. People leaned in. Phones came up. Eleanor's head tilted back again. I touched her arm to keep her upright. Natalie moved closer, her hand hovering, ready to step in. Ethan leaned toward me, close enough that his words didn't travel. "After the cake," he said. I nodded once. The song started and ended unevenly. Applause filled the space. The knife cut clean. Slices were passed. Eleanor didn't reach for hers. Her eyes closed and opened again without focus. Natalie bent down and spoke over Eleanor's head, loud enough to carry. "She's tired. We'll let her rest." I watched the man by the hallway adjust his stance. I watched Richard's hand settle at Natalie's shoulder. I watched Ethan check the window, then the door, then me. The room returned to its rhythm. Conversations resumed. Plates filled. The men in jackets stayed where they were. Ethan touched my arm again. This time there was no signal attached. just pressure, brief and deliberate. We weren't leaving because of a feeling. We were leaving because time had started moving without us. I stood and lifted Eleanor's shawl higher around her shoulders. She didn't resist. The cake table clattered behind me. The house hummed on. We began to move. We didn't rush. Ethan led slightly, just enough to clear space without drawing attention. I kept my pace even, my eyes forward. The side hallway curved toward the front of the house, past the closed door of the downstairs bedroom and the bathroom Eleanor used when the stairs were too much. The music softened behind us. Laughter followed its own timing. At the door, Richard clapped Ethan on the back and thanked him for coming. Ethan smiled, said the cake looked good, and kept moving. Natalie watched us from the edge of the room, her clipboard tucked against her ribs, her mouth set as if she were counting. Outside, the air felt cooler. The sun had dipped enough to throw long lines across the lawn. Ethan's hand stayed at my elbow until we reached the car. He unlocked it, waited until I was inside, then closed the door and locked all four at once. The sound cut through the quiet. He started the engine and backed out slowly, tires turning without gravel. He took a right instead of the left toward downtown, then another right. He drove the perimeter streets until the house fell out of view. Only then did he speak. They've been sedating her. I watched the road pass in measured blocks. How do you know? He kept his eyes on the mirror. Kitchen drawer, behind the silverware tray, unlabeled bottle, crushed residue on the cap. I pictured Natalie's hands on the tray, straightening forks. The indentation on Eleanor's wrist came back to me, the weight of her breathing. Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive, placed it in the cup holder between us. I photographed everything. He turned onto a service road that ran parallel to the highway, then took a shortcut through a row of closed storefronts. The car stayed dark. He didn't turn on the radio. There were papers, he said. One of the men, not a guest. He had a folder under his jacket. I got a shot when he leaned over the counter. My phone buzzed once, sharp in the quiet. An unknown number. 5 words on the screen. Why did you leave? Ethan glanced over, then back to the road. He locked the doors again without looking. Don't answer. I didn't. I watched the message sit there, unchanging. The road opened into a stretch of trees. My signal dropped to 1 bar, then none. Ethan took a turn I didn't recognize and slowed into a gas station set back from the road, the kind with 1 working pump and a flickering light over the ice freezer. He parked along the fence line where the car wouldn't be seen from the highway. He pulled the flash drive back out and handed it to me. Open the files. I used the adapter from the glove box. The first images loaded slowly. Wires under the porch, taped flat, disappearing into the siding beneath the living room window. The next showed the drawer, the bottle, the powder caught in the threads of the cap. Then documents, close enough to read the heading. A declaration of incapacity. Eleanor's name spelled wrong in one place and right in another. Ethan pointed to the signature. That's not hers. My phone buzzed again. No new message, just the same question, waiting. Ethan's voice stayed level. If that filing goes through, they control her accounts, the house, her care. I closed the file and disconnected the drive. The station light hummed. A truck passed on the highway without slowing. Ethan took the phone from my hand and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in years. He held it up, then pressed call. County Sheriff, the voice said after 2 rings. Ethan spoke clearly, without rush. I need to report suspected elder abuse and fraud. We have evidence. The line went quiet on the other end. Then questions, one at a time. Ethan answered them all. When he ended the call, he didn't start the car. He looked at me once, checking. "We're going back," he said. This time, I didn't nod. I fastened my seatbelt instead. We waited for the lights. The patrol cars arrived without sirens. 2 sets of lights cut across the empty lot and settled into stillness. Ethan stepped out first, flash drive in hand, movements measured. I followed and stood close enough to hear every word, but far enough not to interrupt. The deputy took the drive, asked for names, dates, addresses. Ethan answered in complete sentences. No speculation, only what he had seen and recorded. We drove back in a line, the house ahead of us this time, the way you return to a place when the reason has changed. The banner was still up. The driveway was quieter. Most of the cars were gone. The lawn lights had come on, evenly spaced, casting the house in a careful glow. The deputies approached the front door. One knocked, the other angled himself to see the side yard. Ethan and I stood behind them, not touching. The door opened after a pause. Natalie appeared, in the same dress, the fabric creased now. Her makeup softened at the edges. She smiled too quickly. The deputies identified themselves and stated the reason for the visit. Natalie's eyes flicked past them to me, then to Ethan, then back again. She stepped aside without speaking. Inside, the music was off. The room felt larger without it. Eleanor sat where we had left her, the blue shawl still around her shoulders, her head tilted forward. A deputy knelt, spoke her name, asked where she was. Eleanor lifted her eyes slowly and answered, "With the house. With the day." The deputy asked about medication. Natalie said it was in the bathroom. The other deputy went down the hall and returned with an empty cabinet and a single cup by the sink. No labels, no schedule. Richard came in from the kitchen, his voice loud enough to fill the space. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said Eleanor was tired. He said the family was handling it. Ethan stepped forward and held up his phone, the screen already open. "Explain this." The photo filled the space between them, the wire beneath the porch, the bottle behind the tray, the document header, the date typed clean, the signature uneven. Richard stopped speaking. The deputy asked for the papers. Natalie said she didn't know where they were. The man in the jacket appeared at the edge of the hallway and froze when he saw the badges. Another deputy called for paramedics. Eleanor's breathing changed as the room shifted. She straightened a fraction, the shawl sliding down her arms. She looked at me and then at the deputy. "I didn't sign anything," she said. The words were quiet. They held. Natalie started to speak and stopped. Richard's hands dropped to his sides. The deputy read names from the document and asked if Eleanor recognized them. She did. He asked if she consented to anyone managing her affairs. She said no. The paramedics arrived and checked Eleanor's vitals. They asked about recent medication. She shook her head once. A deputy escorted Natalie and Richard outside. No raised voices, no resistance. The banner stirred in the draft and settled again. I stayed with Eleanor as they lifted her onto the stretcher. She held my hand without loosening her grip. The ambulance doors closed and opened again, light spilling onto the driveway. Ethan handed the flash drive to the deputy and signed a receipt. We followed the ambulance to the hospital, the patrol cars behind us this time. The house receded the same way it had earlier, but the order was different now. At the hospital, they admitted Eleanor for observation. They wrote times and dosages on a board and left the space between them blank. I sat in the chair and watched the monitor steady itself. Ethan stood by the door and waited for instructions. The deputy returned our IDs and said they would be in touch. When the room quieted, Eleanor looked at me and tightened her grip once. "I knew something was wrong," she said. I nodded and stayed where I was. Outside, the hallway lights dimmed for the night shift. They kept Eleanor overnight. Observation, the nurse said. Routine, given her age and the medication discrepancy. A clipboard hung at the foot of the bed with boxes left unchecked. Time admitted. Time unknown. Possible interaction. They labeled her belongings and set them on the counter. The blue shawl folded once. Her watch stopped at 6:14. The ring she never took off placed in a clear bag. I sat until visiting hours ended. Ethan stood when the doctor came in, hands at his sides, listening. The doctor spoke in ranges, not conclusions. Blood work pending, toxicology ordered, hydration first, monitoring. The kind of language that keeps options open. When they asked about next of kin, I said I was her granddaughter and gave my name. They asked about legal authority. I said none yet. The doctor nodded and wrote something down. Ethan watched the pen move. We left the hospital close to midnight. The parking lot lights hummed. The air smelled like rain that hadn't arrived. Ethan drove us back to the motel he had booked weeks earlier. The room faced the highway. Trucks passed at regular intervals, the sound steady enough to mark time. Inside, Ethan set the evidence receipt on the desk and lined up our phones beside it. He checked that they were charging. He closed the curtains halfway, then all the way. He sat on the edge of the bed and removed his shoes without looking up. I scrolled through my phone. No new messages. The earlier text still sat there, unanswered. "Why did you leave?" The timestamp didn't change. I archived it without opening the thread. Ethan pulled out his notebook and wrote down everything in order. Arrival time, observations, where he found the bottle, where the wires ran, the deputy's name, the case number. He didn't speculate. He didn't cross things out. When he finished, he tore the page out and placed it with the receipt. At 12:47 a.m., my father's number lit up the screen. I let it ring until it stopped. At 12:53, Natalie's followed. I turned the phone face down. Ethan didn't comment. He wrote the times in the margin. The next morning, the hospital called before breakfast. Eleanor was awake, oriented, asking for me. We drove back under low clouds. The hospital looked the same in daylight, cleaner somehow, less forgiving. Eleanor held my hand while the nurse explained the plan. Fluids, observation continued. A social worker would stop by. They asked if Eleanor felt safe returning home. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the wall, then at me. "No," she said. The word landed and stayed. The social worker wrote it down and asked about alternatives. Eleanor said she would stay with me. She said it like a decision already made. The nurse nodded and added another note to the chart. Mid-morning, a deputy arrived to follow up. He asked for the flash drive again and reviewed the receipt. He said the documents would be sent to the county attorney. He said there would be interviews. He said there were grounds to pursue charges related to exploitation and attempted fraud. Ethan asked what we should do if contacted. The deputy said to refer everything through counsel. He gave us a card and wrote a direct number on the back. In the afternoon, a bank representative called Eleanor's room. They spoke quietly. Accounts were flagged. Transactions paused pending review. Eleanor listened, then handed me the phone when her hand tired. I confirmed addresses and answered security questions I'd heard once before and remembered. By evening, the house in Ashland felt far away. The banner, the cake, the careful alignment of things. In their place were forms and times and decisions written in ink that wouldn't fade. Eleanor slept with a shawl over her shoulders. The monitor marked her breathing in even intervals. Ethan stood by the window and watched the lot empty. We didn't discuss what would happen next. We didn't need to. The process had started. It would move whether anyone wanted it to or not. I sat back down and waited for the next instruction. The interview schedule arrived by email just after dawn. 2 times, 2 rooms, the same building. The subject line listed Eleanor's name and a case number. I printed it at the Motel Business Center and folded the page twice, the way Eleanor used to fold letters before putting them in a drawer. Ethan checked the car and topped off the tank, even though it was already full. At the sheriff's office, the waiting area smelled like disinfectant and old paper. A television mounted high on the wall played the weather without sound. The receptionist took our IDs, slid them back, and asked us to wait. The clock above the door ticked in single seconds. Eleanor went first. A deputy escorted her down the hall. She walked without assistance, the blue shawl folded over her arm instead of on her shoulders. The door closed. The ticking continued. Ethan sat straight-backed, hands on his knees, eyes on the floor. My interview followed. The deputy read from a list and wrote as I answered. Dates, locations, who stood where, what was said and what wasn't. I described the men with clean plates, the wires under the porch, the unlabeled bottle behind the silverware tray. I described the document header and the uneven signature. I didn't add anything else. When he asked about the message, I slid my phone across the table. He photographed the screen and asked if I recognized the number. I didn't. He asked if I responded. I hadn't. He nodded and wrote it down. At the end, he turned the paper toward me and asked me to review it. I checked the times and initialed each page. He thanked me and opened the door. Eleanor was already waiting with Ethan. She stood when she saw me and pressed the folded shawl into my hands as if she were returning something borrowed. Her face looked steadier. Her eyes held. Outside, a county attorney met us by the steps. She introduced herself, explained next steps in plain language. Temporary protective orders, an emergency review of Eleanor's accounts and property, a petition to bar contact while the investigation continued. She said the words without emphasis and handed us a packet with tabs. Ethan asked about the house. The attorney said the locks would be changed that afternoon under an order. He asked about the men in jackets. She said they were being identified. He asked about the documents. She said handwriting analysis was already requested. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When the attorney finished, Eleanor spoke once. I don't want them near me. The attorney nodded and wrote it down. We left the building with the packet and a list of numbers. In the parking lot, Ethan took photos of the license plates that followed us out, then checked them against the deputy's card. None matched. He drove anyway, as if they might. At the hospital, a nurse stopped us to say the toxicology report had returned. She spoke carefully, choosing words that fit the chart. Sedative present, not prescribed, dosage inconsistent with standard care. She handed the printout to Eleanor and waited. Eleanor folded the page once and handed it to me. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look back at the desk. That afternoon, a locksmith called to confirm the time. A bank called to confirm the freeze. A neighbor from Ashland called to say the police were there and the banner was gone. I wrote each call down with the minute hand's position. Near evening, Natalie's name appeared on my phone. A voicemail followed. I didn't play it. I forwarded the file to the attorney's address and archived the thread. We returned to the motel with the packet and the shawl and the folded printout. Ethan laid everything out on the desk and checked each item against the list. He didn't miss anything. Eleanor sat on the bed and watched the trucks pass the window. When she spoke, It was to mark time. They thought I wouldn't notice. I sat beside her and didn't correct anything. The process moved forward. We stayed where we were told. The house in Ashland reopened to us without ceremony. A deputy met us at the curb and waited while the locksmith finished. The new keys were cut clean, tagged, and handed to Eleanor first. She weighed them in her palm as if measuring something familiar that had changed. Inside, the air held the faint smell of frosting and cleaner. The furniture sat where Natalie had placed it. The frames on the wall were still straight. The deputy pointed out the taped seam beneath the living room window and photographed it again, this time with the lights fully on. The wires were thinner than they looked from the porch, flattened to disappear. He traced their path and marked the wall with blue tape. Ethan moved through the rooms without touching anything. He counted outlets. He checked the bathroom cabinet again. Empty. He noted the trash bag by the back door and asked the deputy to secure it. The deputy did. Gloves. Evidence bag. A label with the address and time. Eleanor sat in her chair by the window and watched the process. When the paramedic arrived to clear her for the short visit, Eleanor answered questions in full sentences. Date, location, reason she was there. The paramedic nodded and stepped back. In the kitchen, the silverware tray sat exactly where it had been. The drawer slid open without resistance. The space behind the tray was clean now. Too clean. Ethan pointed it out. The deputy photographed the absence and wrote it down. The county attorney arrived mid-morning and walked the house with us. She opened cabinets and closets, noted what was missing, what had been moved. She asked Eleanor about her papers. Eleanor said they were usually kept in a blue folder in the hall cabinet. The cabinet was empty. The attorney paused, then turned to the deputy. That matters. Eleanor stood and walked to the hallway on her own. She stopped at the bedroom door and looked inside. The bed was made tight. The nightstand drawer was closed. She opened it and found the watch box empty. She closed the drawer again without comment. The attorney explained next steps at the dining table. Inventory, retrieval, a court order for the bank to produce records. She slid forms across the surface and placed a pen beside them. Eleanor signed where indicated, her hand steady. The signatures matched the ones I knew. A neighbor stopped by with a bag of mail she had been holding since the party. Utility notices, a bank envelope unopened, a letter from a physician addressed to Eleanor, the seal broken. The attorney took the letter and added it to the file. Outside, the deputy finished securing the porch. He removed the tape and placed the wiring into a bag. He asked Ethan if he had noticed anything else. Ethan listed the positions of the men at the party and the timing of their movements. The deputy nodded and recorded it. Before we left, Eleanor asked to see the banner. The deputy had already taken it down and folded it. He handed it to her. She ran her thumb along the crease where it had hung straight. She handed it back. In the car, we didn't speak right away. The road out of town was clear. At the first stoplight, Eleanor looked at me and spoke once. They planned it. I nodded and kept my eyes on the signal. Back at the motel, the attorney called to confirm arrests were pending and contact restrictions were in place. She said the men in jackets were being interviewed. She said more documents had been located off-site. Ethan wrote the time and closed the notebook. We packed Eleanor's things into the trunk, only what she needed. The blue shawl went on top. We locked the room and checked out. As we pulled onto the highway, Ashland fell behind us. The house became another address on a form. The process stayed with us. We drove north without stopping. The call came just after noon, routed through the attorney's office. Ethan put it on speaker and set the phone on the center console. The county attorney spoke in the same measured cadence she had used on the courthouse steps. Arrests executed, charges filed, fraud, attempted exploitation, Unlawful surveillance. She listed the statutes without emphasis and said the initial hearing would be scheduled within 72 hours. Eleanor listened with her hands folded over the blue shawl. When the attorney finished, Eleanor asked one question about the house. The attorney said it would remain secured and under review. Eleanor nodded once. The call ended. We drove the rest of the way north without radio or conversation. At a rest stop, Ethan checked the tires again and wiped the windshield. I bought coffee and wrote the time on the receipt before folding it into my pocket. Eleanor sat on the bench and watched traffic pass, counting nothing aloud. At home, we set Eleanor up in the guest room. The bed was low, the lamp switch easy to reach. Her watch started again when I wound it, the second hand ticking into place. She placed it on the nightstand and aligned it with the edge. That afternoon, the bank confirmed the freeze in writing. Account numbers redacted, effective immediately. A courier delivered copies of the filings with stamps and dates. Ethan placed each document into a folder and labeled it. Eleanor signed where asked, her signature consistent across pages. A deputy arrived to collect additional statements. He photographed the watch box and the broken seal on the physician's letter. He asked Eleanor to describe her routine the week before the party. She listed meals and medications by time. When he asked about the sedatives, she said she hadn't known their names. She said she knew the effect. I was kept quiet, she said. The deputy wrote it down and did not ask her to repeat it. Near evening, Natalie's voicemail forwarded from the attorney's office arrived as a transcript. Apologies framed as explanations. Explanations framed as concern. No acknowledgement of the documents. No mention of the wiring. The attorney replied on our behalf and copied the case number. Contact prohibited. All communication through counsel. Eleanor asked me to read the transcript once. I did. She asked me to stop before the end. I did. She folded the shawl and set it aside. The next morning, the hearing date came through. A time, a room, a judge's name. Ethan printed the notice and placed it in the folder. He wrote a checklist on the back of an envelope. Evidence delivered, witnesses notified, accommodations confirmed. He checked each item once and set the pen down. A neighbor from Ashland called to say the house was quiet. New locks, no banner, mail redirected. The neighbor apologized for not noticing sooner. Eleanor said nothing and thanked her for calling. That afternoon, Eleanor walked the block with me. The pace was slow but even. She stopped at the corner and looked back once, as if marking where she was. We returned home without comment. When night settled, the house held a different order. Forms stacked neatly, phones charging, the watch ticking. Eleanor sat at the table and wrote a list of names she wanted notified and names she did not. She signed the bottom and dated it. Ethan placed the list into the folder and closed it. The hearing would happen. The process would continue. It would not move quickly or cleanly, but it would move. Eleanor went to bed early. Before the light went off, she spoke once, without looking up. They thought silence was the same as consent. I closed the door gently and stood in the hall until the watch ticked twice more. The night held. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. No windows, fluorescent lights set too high. The seal on the wall centered and level, like everything else in this process. Eleanor sat beside the attorney, the blue shawl folded on her lap instead of around her shoulders. Ethan and I took the row behind them. The clock read 9:02 when the clerk called the case. Names were spoken in full, charges read into the record. The attorney presented the sequence without color, dates, documents, photographs, toxicology. The judge listened without interruption. Eleanor was asked to stand and confirm her understanding. She did, her voice even, her posture straight. When the judge asked whether she consented to any change in control of her affairs, she answered once. No. The word traveled cleanly and stopped. It did not echo. The judge issued temporary orders from the bench. Continued no contact, asset protection extended, a conservatorship petition denied pending further review. The next date set. The gavel came down without drama. The clerk marked the time. Outside the courthouse, the air felt wider. A reporter stood across the street and lowered her phone when she saw the attorney shake her head. The attorney gave Eleanor a copy of the orders and explained the timelines again. She said there would be appeals. She said there would be delays. She said the record mattered. Eleanor thanked her and folded the papers once. She handed them to me. The edges aligned. We went for coffee at a place that didn't know us. Eleanor ordered tea. She placed the cup carefully on the saucer and waited for it to cool. Ethan checked the exits out of habit and then stopped himself. The room was ordinary. That was enough. Back home, the mail arrived redirected and sorted. Statements reflected holds in clear language. A locksmith invoice followed with a receipt stamped paid. The bank sent confirmation letters. The social worker checked in and scheduled a follow-up. Each item joined the folder. Each item had a place. Eleanor asked to walk the garden. She knelt and pressed soil between her fingers, testing moisture. She chose a spot and planted something small she had brought in her pocket, a cutting wrapped in damp paper. She covered it and patted the ground flat. She stood without help. That evening, the attorney called to say the men in jackets had been identified and charged. The surveillance equipment traced to a vendor, the forged documents tied to a printer off-site. She said the case would take time. She said Eleanor's testimony had weight. After the call, Eleanor sat at the table and opened her notebook. She wrote for a while, then tore out a page and slid it toward me. It listed instructions, not requests, instructions. Who should be notified, what should be returned, where originals should be stored. She signed at the bottom. Ethan witnessed. He wrote the date and his name. Later, when the house settled, Eleanor stood at the window and watched the streetlights come on. The watch ticked on the nightstand behind her. She did not reach for the shawl. They mistook quiet for permission, she said. I stood with her and looked out at the ordinary street. Cars passed. A dog barked once and stopped. Somewhere down the block, a door closed. The process would continue. There would be filings and dates and rooms without windows. There would be waiting. But the order had changed. The papers said so. The clock said so. The house said so. Eleanor turned from the window and went to bed. I closed the notebook and placed it in the folder. Ethan turned off the light in the hall. The watch kept time through the dark.